Hi, Facebook Live. I'll be with you in just a second. I'm just going to join Periscope as well. Welcome today wherever you're joining us in the world. Okay, I just need to quickly get Periscope set up. There we go. Hi, welcome everybody on Periscope and Facebook Live. I'm going to talk for a few minutes. Ooh. Wardrobe malfunction. I'm going to talk for a few minutes. Welcome. Hi everybody on Periscope. I'm just going to swap these around actually. Just put that there for a second, I think. And okay. It's only the second time I've done one of these Periscopes and Facebook Lives at the same time, so it's kind of riding the wave of the technology, and let's see what we can do today. Hello everybody, my name's Sarah Graham. I'm an addiction therapist. I have a company in the United Kingdom called Sarah Graham Solutions, and I am based in Los Angeles at the moment, although I will be returning to England soon. So just to welcome you, we are doing this broadcast today to support the fantastic new blog, Letting the Light In. And if you haven't had a chance to go to Letting the Light In yet, please do make a note of this website address and take some time to visit it. It's www.lettingthelightin.com, and it's a new blog that's a resource for parents and carers and anybody who's affected by somebody else's addiction. It's a great resource which will grow as the author adds new blogs and as parents, carers and those affected by addiction contribute to the website. I feel very privileged to be part of supporting it because any addiction therapist or rehab or doctor or anybody who works in this field will tell you that there aren't enough resources anywhere in the world really for supporting parents and families and loved ones. Often the person who has the addiction themselves will get the support, and there are some excellent resources out there for the addict themselves, but it's often the parents and the families who don't get the support that they need. Of course, when you have somebody in your family who's affected by addiction, it can be like living in a war zone, and it's not uncommon to see parents who actually have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, as a consequence. Oh, that's interesting. You should be able to see and hear me, Penny. I just saw your message, and it looks like I'm broadcasting. I think that's a technical issue your end with regard to Wi-Fi, probably. Yes, somebody else can see and hear, so I think that's probably a Wi-Fi issue, Penny. Okay, so I'm just going to carry on talking. Oh, great. And Lilith on Facebook can hear me loud and clear. That's fantastic. Okay, so I'm just going to talk for a couple of minutes, and then I'm basically going to be here for 50 minutes until 12:50 LA time, 8:50 UK time. And I want to be available to answer any questions that you might have. My dog, Scotty, has decided it's playtime beneath me, so I may have to control him at some point. Scotty, please, will you sit down? Sit. Stop it. He's been a bit unwell for the last few days, so I'm quite pleased to see him playing, but not right now. Okay, so as I was saying, often the addicts themselves get the support and the help, but the family members don't, and that's why this blog, Letting the Light In, is going to be so important. In the United States, where I'm currently based, we are seeing some very good treatment programs for family members, and of course there are free resources out there for family members, but they are very patchy. In the United Kingdom, we have the fantastic charity Drug Fam that Elizabeth Burton Phillips started after she very sadly lost one of her two twin sons to drug addiction, and that's an amazing charity that is doing good work and spreading across the country. There's also AdFam is a resource out there for family members, and of course there are the Al-Anon family groups which have meetings across the country. I often send parents to Al-Anon, or suggest that parents go to Al-Anon it is a spiritual program, and some people do have issues with going to what they perceive as a religious program. It's not a religious program, and I think it's important that anybody who is interested in getting support from a 12-step program be aware that it's a spiritual program. It's not a religious program. It's somewhere that you can go. They talk about higher power, but your higher power can be anything, and your higher power can just be the group of people that you're going to spend time with. You don't have to have a religious affiliation. You don't have to believe in God in terms of a spiritual entity. It's just the understanding is that you can't do this on your own, that basically addiction is stronger than any one individual, and that it's impossible to tackle it just on your own. And that makes sense, really. It's really is a team effort. You know, I'm a person in recovery myself, and I struggled with addiction for many years, and if I could have solved it on my own, I would have done. But it's, you know, I'm an intelligent person. I'm a person who had resources. Obviously, a white woman, middle class. I had resources. If it was possible to do it on my own, I would have done it on my own. I couldn't, and that's the experience I come across with all of my clients. You know, I work with some of the most successful people in the world, and believe me, these people would have sorted this out on their own if they could have. It's not possible. So if you're a person who doesn't have good resources around you in terms of what we call recovery capital, that's a supportive family or a supportive school or access to a counsellor or access to resources of any kind, then of course it's impossible to do this on your own. So you do need to reach out. I'm just aware that I'm not actually seeing any questions coming up yet. If you have any questions, please do start writing them for me so I can see the kind of things that people are interested in today. I'll make a note of them. Okay, thank you. That's a very good question from Penny. A question about the threat of violence. Okay, so let me just talk a little bit about substance misuse. There is a difference between somebody who is experimenting with substances and somebody who is developing a difficulty, a dependency or an addiction. And one of the things that we can obviously see that this is certainly becoming a problem is if your young person in the home is getting to a stage of dependency where they're starting to threaten you or threaten their own well-being if they can't have access to substances. What you have to know about... Sorry. Sit down, please, Scotty. What you have to know about addiction is it's based in the amygdala area of the brain. And the amygdala is the old reptilian area of the brain. The prefrontal cortex is the area of the brain where the rational kind of decision-making personality part of the person is based. And the amygdala is much older. It's where the drives, the instinctual drives are based: fight, flight, sex, desire for food and water. So it's a much older area of the brain, and it's very powerful, and that's where the addiction is based. So basically somebody who's got an addiction has got a battle going on between different parts of their own being, and the old reptilian part of the brain is obviously far stronger because that's the survival mechanisms. So unfortunately, as the addiction progresses, it can feel to the person like they have to have the substance. It's not a question of I would really like it. It's not like, you know, wanting to have a piece of chocolate cake or a piece of chocolate where you really, really would like it. It's a case, it can actually feel like a survival threat if you don't have it. And at that point, unfortunately, some people do start crossing over their moral boundaries. It doesn't, and one of the things that I frequently come across with parents is parents will say to me, I didn't raise my child this way, I'm shocked that they're behaving in this way, and start blaming themselves in some way for something that they don't know what they've done. And what I would say to you is, do not blame yourself, do not beat yourself up about this, because this is the addiction. It's a progressive illness, and as it progresses, the person will cross over moral boundaries, and they can be moral boundaries that they've had from a very early age that you've instilled in them. That doesn't matter. It's the addiction driving the behaviour. It's a progressive illness. So to come to this question that Penny just asked about a threat of violence, if there is a threat of violence, sorry, one second, I'm really sorry about this. I'm just going to put the dog in the other room. Scotty, no. In there, please. Sit down. Sit down. Sit. Never work with children and animals, it's true. Yes, if there's a threat of yes, Catty does want to play. As I said, I'm quite pleased that he wants to play because he's been very ill for a few days, but not the best time to choose to play. So if there is a threat of violence, this person is really getting to a stage where we have to take action. It is absolutely not acceptable for a parent to be facing violence in their own home. And boundaries have to be set, and boundaries have to be stuck to, because do not think that this is magically going to get better on its own. It's absolutely not. And you need to take action, and that may involve taking police action. So I'm just going to read a question coming on Facebook Live and make a note of it, and then I'll continue this answer. Yes, there's a question from Lilith about legal highs. Spice is mentioned, and I will come to that. Okay, so yes, do not think that this is a situation that's just going to magically improve on its own. It's not. And if you don't stand up to these threats of violence, it will only get worse. The threats will become actual violence, and we do see that. And this is one of the issues around stronger strains of cannabis. That's quite an irony, really, given that the old forms of cannabis that many parents are familiar with, the idea of somebody becoming violent on that is completely ridiculous. You know, the kind of cannabis that used to be available in the 60s, the 70s and the 80s, people would smoke that and the violence would be the last thing on their mind. And that's because that substance has a lot of CBD in it. But the new stronger strains of cannabis have been deliberately bred to have lower levels of CBD but very high levels of THC. THC is the active chemical that makes you feel high. It's very trippy, and it's the substance that's being linked with psychosis and even cannabis-induced schizophrenia. So that substance and that balance of chemicals is a completely different drug to the drug that it used to be. And so we definitely see that some young people, that their ability to regulate their emotions is completely disrupted by the strength of this cannabis, and their dependency gets so strong so quickly that they do actually start behaving in ways which are really threatening. And I have heard from many parents about a child crossing over that line and threatening and actually even carrying out acts of violence in desperate need to get hold of this drug or to get money to get hold of this drug. So what do I mean when I say to you, set a boundary and stick to it? Of course, the ultimate boundary, and the boundary that parents absolutely don't want to have to lay down and enforce because it's so difficult and it's so opposite to what one feels a parent should do. But this is a situation that no parent obviously imagines that they're going to be in. The ultimate boundary is, of course, to call the police and to actually involve the police in this situation. Now, parents say to me often, well, I don't want to do that because I don't want to get my child a criminal record. Well, the reality is, in nearly all cases, unless there's been a real act of violence and it's grievous bodily harm or something, the police are not going to charge your child the first time, even sometimes the second time or the third time, but they will come to the house and they will have a conversation with your child. And it's really important to break through the denial of the seriousness of the situation that we involve the police if this kind of behaviour is happening. Because, as I say, it's not going to magically improve and go away. It's just going to get worse unless you stand up to it. And I'll leave that there for the time being and come on to the question of spice, unless somebody would like to ask me a supplementary question. And I'm just going to have a sip of water for a second. Okay. So the question of spice, you're absolutely right to be worried about the effect of legal highs and spice, Lilith. These substances are very powerful, as anybody who's seen a person who's high on spice or other legal highs can testify. When I was younger and we were kind of experimenting when I was sort of 14, 15, this kind of substances we were experimenting with were the kind of things like nutmeg and banana skins, which were rumoured to have an effect, which of course didn't really. And unfortunately, what's happened through the last 15-20 years is that we now have a plethora of so-called legal highs. They're not actually legal anymore in the United Kingdom. We have actually taken action to ban these substances now with the psychoactive substances bill. So head shops have been closing it down across the country. Of course, it hasn't completely got rid of them because there's an underground market, but we have seen a big closure of head shops. But these substances are still very much available. What we need to know about these substances, of course, is that they are novel psychoactive substances, so we don't have any kind of an evidence base about what the long-term effects are. We don't know whether 15 years down the line, 20 years down the line, we're going to see horrible effects on the brain. So everybody who's taking one of these substances is in effect treating themselves like a laboratory rat and experimenting on themselves. And these substances have a powerful effect. Some of these synthetic cannabinoids can actually have a more powerful effect than even skunk cannabis, the stronger strains of skunk cannabis. And we are seeing problems in the prisons, and we're certainly seeing the problems on the streets throughout the United Kingdom. I would say to anybody who's thinking about using these substances, or who has a young person who's using these substances, it's really important to take action straight away, because we don't know what harm is happening to the teenager right now, and I've seen people with horrible addictions to these substances, which have put them in psychiatric hospitals, and we also don't know what the long-term impact of taking these substances is. So they should not be viewed as legal highs, so therefore not a problem. I think that was one of the problems with the fact that these substances weren't banned for a long time, was that a lot of young people would sit in front of me in a counselling session and say things like, well, they're legal, so therefore they can't be that serious because the government would have banned them if they were. Which is good logic, but unfortunately it's not true. They weren't banned because they were they were appearing on the market so quickly, and the chemical compositions were changing so rapidly that it was very difficult for the legal structure to keep up with that. Finally, the government found a way of shutting the door on them in terms of coming up with a generic classification, but in some ways the horse has bolted, and these substances have become very widely available and very widely used. I hope that answers your question, Lilith. Does anybody else have another question? Okay, thank you. How do you begin to get your addict to seek help? Okay, well, the first thing I would say about this is that we have to break that down, especially when we're talking about young people. Have we got a young addict in our family, or have we got somebody who is experimenting with substances? And I'm loath to put the label addict on a young person, because obviously that label is a label that that can in its own way cause problems initially, but what is fair to say is that, of course, any young person experimenting with a substance like stronger strains of cannabis is exposing themselves to risk, and the first thing that parents need to do is to educate themselves before they start really trying to educate the young person. They need to come from an informed position. And unfortunately, because the world out there has changed so much in the last 20 years, don't assume that because you've got knowledge of substances from your teenage years or from your own time at college that you know what is going on now. It's been a very fast-moving environment, and things have really changed. So bring yourself up to speed. Go to the Frank website. That's www.talktofrank.com, and that's got a lot of information about novel psychoactive substances, about cannabis, and about all of the traditional drugs that a young person may encounter. For example, cocaine is now much more freely available across the United Kingdom and across the world than it used to be. We've also got newer substances as well, like methamphetamine, which has become available. So there are some very powerful substances out there that that parents probably don't even know about, and certainly don't know the street name. So educate yourself. then of course it's important to start having a conversation with your young person. The last thing you want to do initially is to come down really heavy before you know what all the facts are. It's fair to say that many young people will go through a period of experimentation with alcohol and with drugs, and that doesn't mean that they are going to develop a problem. And how we handle the news that our young person is experimenting is very important. So that's what I would say first of all. Having said that, many parents don't get awareness that their young person is experimenting until it has become a problem in some way. And of course, if the young person is caught using at school, then that's a problem, because that's completely inappropriate and breaks the school rules, and the school often has a right to suspend the young person, if not expel them. Some schools have very hardline policies around this. So if the young person is behaving in a way which is bringing them into conflict with their education, or has put them in harm's way or put another person in harm's way, then obviously action does need to be taken. What I think is very important for parents is to not put your head in the sand and think, oh, well, this is just a bit of cannabis, or this is just a bit of light experimentation, especially if you as a parent have a history of some experimentation. Perhaps you had even quite a heavy period of drug use at college. I mean, you know, a lot of parents who are my age, did have experiment through college and through their 20s, and came out of it relatively unscathed. You know, people who went through the ecstasy dance culture, a lot of those people went through quite an experimental phase, then stopped using as they got older, or just returned to the more traditional drugs like alcohol, and didn't develop a problem. And so you may have quite a sort of laissez-faire attitude to drugs. But what you have to remember is that the drugs are much more powerful that are available to young people today, that we're seeing a lot of what we call polysubstance abuse, and that's kind of mixing different concoctions of substances, which can be very dangerous. And when I say dangerous, I mean can even kill, in terms of the mix of some of the chemicals that people put together because they don't know what they're doing. And also we are seeing addiction can affect people very quickly at a young age. Okay, I'm just taking note of a couple of other questions. Okay, well, I'm getting two questions, one from Periscope and one from Facebook, which are pretty much the same question, which is about support for friends and family members. Okay, the first thing I would say is that if you have a problem which looks like it's a dependency problem, then of course it's important to involve your GP, that's your general practitioner doctor in the UK, the problem with this, though, unfortunately, is that many doctors haven't really had very much education around addiction, and so especially some doctors of the older generation may give you messages around cannabis which are completely out of date, and which can actually add to the problem rather than diminish the problem. So this is some of the things I'm going to say to you now. I have to add caveats, because in an ideal world a young person would go to the doctor and they'd be given completely up-to-date informed information. We can't rely on that. There's an enormous denial around cannabis still in the UK, and here in Los Angeles there's even more denial around the seriousness of cannabis. If you can afford to hire an addiction therapist to see your young person, then that is preferable, because addiction therapists have a specific form of knowledge and a specific way of communicating with a young person, which is very different to traditional therapy. Traditional person-centered therapy can actually again make things worse, because it's about staying in the person's frame of reference and building rapport and not particularly challenging them, whereas addiction therapy is much more of a kind of interactive form of therapy, and it's much more educational and it's much more challenging, because one of the big things about addiction, and anybody who's had an addict in their life will know this, one of the big things about addiction is denial. the denial process goes hand in hand with the progression of the illness. And what I mean by that is, as the person's behaviour gets worse, their use of substances increases in terms of the range of substances, or in terms of their tolerance is increasing, so the quantity of substance they're using is increasing, and so their behaviour is changing, and maybe they're disengaging from their peer group, they're them starting to mix with a new, more dangerous peer group. They're starting to cut off from the things which have given them pleasure, which have been healthy pursuits previously, maybe playing sport or horse riding, or just doing things that are social, and kind of retreating more into their bedroom, or retreating away from social connection with other people unless it involves drinking and drugging. As those kind of things start to happen, the denial process is also growing. And what the denial process does is it actually stops the person seeing the reality of their situation. It's kind of like putting the blinkers on, and so you can't actually see the seriousness of the situation that you're in. And to anybody who wonders how strong this denial process is, it's incredibly strong, to the point that I've had clients. I'll tell you one specific story. I once had a client when I was working in the NHS who had end-stage liver disease. He was a very, very ill person. And he walked in the room with me, and I was totally shocked when I saw him, because he was bright yellow, including the whites of his eyes were bright yellow. And we were talking about his drinking, his relationship with alcohol, and he was basically trying to tell me that he drinks, just a couple of drinks a day. He was at that level of denial in terms of not owning the quantities he was drinking, and the regularity and the seriousness of his drinking. And I realised that he literally had no idea how poorly he was. And he'd actually been told by doctors previously that he was in a life-threatening situation, and he'd forgotten that. The denial process can make you forget even serious conversations like that from a doctor telling you that you need to take action or you're going to die. And when we stood in front of a mirror in my clinic room, and I asked him to look at himself and describe himself, he couldn't actually see how yellow he was. He saw himself as just looking normal. He couldn't actually see that he was bright yellow. That's how serious the denial process can be in terms of hijacking consciousness and making black seem white and white seem black, or in this case, white skin seem yellow. Sorry, white skin seem white when it was in fact yellow. So that's how serious the denial process is. So in answer to your question, sorry, this is a bit of a long-winded answer, Lilith, but in answer to your question, the first thing that friends and family can do to support the person is to not buy into the lies and denial process. People who have addictions can be very strong-willed people. They can come across as very certain. They can be, we often see a combination of a large ego but low self-worth. And the large ego part of the person's personality can be very convincing and make a very convincing case for why everything's fine, and you're making too much of a fuss about this, and you're just nagging or getting things out of perspective. Don't buy into that denial process. If you strongly feel, or you've seen things which are really worrying to you, then that is the truth. Listen to your gut. Even if you haven't got much actual evidence, but you have a sense that something is going badly wrong, and you're starting to see or notice real changes in your friend or loved one, don't dismiss that gut feeling, and actually break the walls of silence with the other people around that person. Quite often, the person who is sick will try and kind of divide and rule, and try and persuade you not to talk to the other friends around that person, or not to talk to family members, not to share pieces of information that you may have. And that is very important, not to buy into that kind of manipulation. And actually, if you are very worried about a person, to disregard their appeals around, don't tell X person this, and actually, if you can, meet up with the other friends, meet up with the family, have a conference and share information, so that you really get as much of a picture as possible of what's actually going on. And then from that point forward, when you do know the seriousness of the situation, it's really important to work together as a team to challenge the reality of the person, to confront them with the seriousness, to not let them get away with things, to not enable them, and to start using what we call tough love. Now, tough love is a topic in itself, and I've brought a book from my library shelf for you to have a look at, which is called Love First, which is by Jeff and Deborah J. This is a fantastic book for any family member or loved one of somebody who has an addiction, because it really lays out how addiction works. Joanne's just asked a question. Are you in denial about women in addiction? Okay, women in addiction. Let's have a look at that in a second. So just to finish this this issue, yes, read this book about tough love. Google tough love and read some articles around tough love, and start looking at what you as friends and family members can do. Do not think there is nothing you can do. Historically, there has been this message that's gone out to family members that said you have to let the person hit bottom, and that there's nothing you can do until they've hit bottom, because they're not going to seek change. Well, of course, the ultimate rock bottom for any person with an addiction is death. As the substances available to young people have become more powerful, and the combinations of substances that young people are using are more deadly, we do see young people dying. And one of the saddest events that I've been to in my annual calendar is the Drug Fam annual Bereaved by Addiction conference. And of course, many families do experience that. And that's not to say that somebody who, if your child is experimenting with a bit of cannabis, that you need to stop, sleeping at night and worry horribly about that. But that is where addiction leads to ultimately. NA have a saying for it, which is addiction ends in jails, institutions, and death. And it is a life-threatening illness, so it is really important to take this seriously, and to do all you can. And when you are feeling perhaps bad that you're not doing what the addict wants, especially if they're begging you for money to pay off their dealer and saying they're going to be threatened by their dealer if they don't, when you're facing any of those kind of big manipulations, which are very common, just remind yourself that yes, you could intervene at this point and make their life easier by paying off the debt, or by giving them the ride, or by buying them the new clothes, or by paying their rent this month because they can't afford it. Whatever the particular request is, yes, right here, right now, you can take away that pain. But in taking away that pain, you're also taking away the consequence of their own action. And all you're doing is you're buying them a bit more time in active addiction. That's all you're doing. And that's a very difficult message to hear. And one thing that I think is also very important for all loved ones to think about is that as your addict is progressing in their addiction, you will also be going on a path of progression in terms of your codependency. And codependency is, again, that's a topic in itself and would take 50 minutes to go through adequately. But if you don't know what codependency is, this is the seminal text on codependency. It's called Codependent No More by Melody Beattie. And there's a very good app in the App Store called The Language of Letting Go, which has daily readings about codependency. What it's basically about, though, is one of the aspects of codependency is caretaking. And one of the things that can be very attractive when we're codependent about somebody with an addiction is they can really need us, in a very visceral way, and seem very lost and very kind of adrift. And as a parent, if you have a child who really seems to be, not able to kind of function and very clingy, that can seem attractive on the one hand, in terms of the baby that won't grow up, that still needs the parent. But in terms of addiction, those behaviours can pull you into a very unhealthy pattern of relating, and the child may be growing up and becoming an adult and actually living in your home as an adult and not thriving in terms of not getting a job or not going out into the world, not building friendships, not getting into relationships, and just kind of staying a child in an adult body. It's very important that you look at your own issues of codependency and don't stay stuck in that, because those behaviours are just going to enable the addiction and not going to ultimately help your child achieve the things in life that you want them to achieve, and can of course lead to an early death. Okay, coming to the question of women in addiction. Okay, and then I'll come to your question, Penny, about rehab. Okay, one of the criticisms, which is a valid criticism of the AA Big Book, which is this book here, the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, which is the original text that was written by Bill W. in the 1930s in America, which delineates the 12 steps, which some of you may have heard about. One of the problems with this book is it's very much written about those early experiences of addiction, and most of the people who came into AA in the early days were men who were men who'd really rock bottomed on alcohol. The book has quite a lot of sexism in it, in terms of, there's a chapter called For the Wives, and there's a lot of language which can seem quite sexist. And there are some very valid criticisms of all of that in terms of engaging young women. And you have to, when I came into recovery, I was very kind of opposed to anything which I thought wasn't valuing me as a woman, and I was very much looking for the differences, as they say. And women in addiction do have some different issues and to men, and of course one of the huge drivers of addiction is trauma. In terms of, again, we could have a whole session on what causes addiction. Well, we know that there is, in many cases, a genetic predisposition. Addiction can run in families, but we also know that genes aren't the whole story. They're probably about 50% of the story, and the thing that seems to turn those genes on is trauma. Most of the clients I sit with have experienced trauma of one kind or another. For example, it's reckoned that 1 in 10 of the general population have an addiction, but as many as a quarter, if not a third, of the LGBTI population, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex population, have an addiction. And I would say the reason why that is, it's complicated, but one of the big reasons is trauma. And trauma can be big events, like the loss of a loved one, but trauma can also be small events, or trauma can be knowing that you're gay from a young age and growing up in a world where you're surrounded by imagery which suggests that the norm and the only thing that's acceptable is to be straight. Growing up in a religious environment where there's homophobia that's legitimized as kind of the word of God is very traumatic for LGBTI people. Trauma is a big factor. Anyway, to come back to this issue of women often have experienced sexual trauma, and I think as we go forward in terms of the work with all people with addictions, we are discovering that sexual trauma is much more common for boys and men than we previously thought. The shame around having been the victim of childhood sexual abuse for men is enormous. I mean, it's enormous for everybody, but it can be very emasculating for a boy or a man to admit sexual trauma. But women certainly have huge trauma histories, often if they have had an addiction for a long time. And some of that, if your addiction is alcohol, a lot of that trauma you may not even remember because you might have been in a blackout, for example. So to answer that question, Joanne, are we in denial about women in addiction? I think we probably are, in terms of joining up the pieces as well, in terms of looking at things like love addiction and the role of love addiction in women staying in violent and abusive relationships, in terms of the specific issues of women in addiction. it's certainly true. I sit on the advisory council on the misuse of drugs, and one thing that became very evident to me quite quickly sitting on that council is how much of the scientific evidence base is based on research that's been done with men. Men and male bodies are the standard in terms of the evidence, and women and women's issues and women's specific experience is often sidelined or not seen as important, or just the research hasn't been done. So yes, we probably are in denial about women and addiction. I think also in terms of the part that hormones play and the hormonal cycle, there's a lot of work that could be done around that. Certainly we see that women's addictions can very much tie in with their hormonal cycle, that can be a real factor in terms of mood. Quite often we have dual diagnosis situations as well with people with addictions, and what I mean by that is somebody may have an addiction and they may also have an underlying depression, or they may have an anxiety disorder. The depression and the anxiety disorder might be linked to hormonal issues as well, or issues around fertility or the loss of a child. It's very common that I work with women in their 20s or 30s who have trauma related to the loss of a child, or having to give a child up, or having to have an abortion, and that has been unprocessed. So that's a great question, Joanne, thank you, and a big issue. We've got about 10 minutes left. Okay. So I'm just trying to see the end of your question, Joanne. Oh yes, terrible fear that children will be taken from them. Yes, I absolutely agree. Women. Sorry, Penny, I missed that question. I'll come back to that in a second. Can you post that question again, Penny? Yes, the issue of children and children being taken away is huge. Whilst I'm in LA, I've just recently got security clearance to get by the probation service to go into the juvenile detention centre here in Los Angeles, and one of the big issues for young women there is that many of them have had children taken away. And of course, if you've had a child taken away and that child has been adopted, that's a trauma, that's a huge trauma that can make getting clean and staying clean very difficult. I think that it's important that we try and support women in terms of their relationship with their children. Of course, sometimes children do need to be taken into care to protect them from a parent's substance misuse, but we also need to weigh up the needs of the child and the needs of the mother or the needs of the parent, and we need a more sophisticated approach in terms of trying to maintain that relationship, maybe having a longer term fostering period while the mother gets clean, with a view to reuniting the mother with the child. And I mean, one thing I think of when I think about this is the fact that the people who have the best outcomes in terms of addiction treatment and staying clean after treatment are pilots. And I think one of the reasons why pilots who come into recovery have the best outcomes are because the airline authorities, of course, have incredibly rigorous monitoring of the pilot when he or she returns to flying, and the pilot knows absolutely that if they relapse, they will lose their career, and that's it, game over. That the airline has given them the opportunity to get clean, to have appropriate treatment, and that when they go back, that it's really important that they carry on using the tools that they've been given, and that they don't slack off and stop going to meetings or stop going to therapy or stop doing the work that they need to do to stay clean. And I think likewise with mothers and babies, or mothers and children, it's very important that we build in the protecting the child, that's fundamental, but also recognizing that if that child gets taken away permanently, that you are condemning that young woman to a very traumatic future and a lot of grief, which can be deadly. I mean, it can. I mean, that's the reality. So that's a very interesting issue. Thank you, Joanne, and thank you for raising that. Penny, coming back to your question, and I know this question is related to today's theme, which is keeping hope. It's very true to say that addiction is there's no magic bullet treatment for addiction. It would be so lovely if I could say to you that come and see me, or come and see an addiction therapist, or go to rehab and spend a lot of money if you've got it, and that will be the end of the problem. Unfortunately, that isn't the case. I mean, one of the reasons why I love my job is because we are in a relatively new field, and this is a field of knowledge which is expanding literally month by month, especially as we develop more understanding of the brain and how it functions. But I think also we are realizing how addiction affects literally every area of a person's life and well-being, and it's very easy for people to lose hope when the person that they love has had a period of clean time and then relapses. And that can be very devastating. And some parents and some friends and some partners decide to cut loose and to not have that person in their life anymore. And I understand that, and there are times when certainly we need to withdraw, detach with love is the expression we use. But what I would say to you is, do not give up hope. There are many instances of people who have relapsed multiple times, and I've even come across people who have had multiple rehabs and have then got into recovery and stayed in recovery. And I wish I could give you the answer as to what made the difference that time. Why was it that treatment 4 worked whereas treatments 1, 2 and 3 didn't? Or why was it that this particular therapist worked, or the relationship with this therapist worked, but the other therapist the person didn't engage with? I can't give you a simple answer, and there is no magic bullet solution for addiction. But what I can tell you is that I 100% believe in my heart, and I've seen this in my own experience of trying to get clean and then getting clean. I started my recovery process in 1997. I went to my first recovery meeting and went to see my first counsellor, and I didn't finally get sober and clean of other substances until 2001. And in that time, I went through a lot of different kind of experimentations. I went through a lot of different ways of looking at addiction, and I had the experience that many people have when I went into recovery the first time, that I didn't want to hear the message that complete abstinence was necessary. I wanted to hang on to a substance, be it cannabis or be it white wine or be it whatever. I didn't want to let go of all of the different mood altering chemicals, because many addicts find the idea of being completely abstinent to be horrendous. And not surprisingly, because when you take all the substances or the addictive behaviours, like addiction to pornography or addiction to gambling or addiction to exercise or addiction to food or addiction to shopping, there are so many different routes to the illness of addiction. If you start realising the extent and the multiplicity of addictions in your life, and that you need to tackle all of them, it can seem overwhelming. And to anybody who doesn't have compassion, just think about how difficult it is to change your own behaviour. And it may be something simple, like, I don't know, you might decide at Lent, if you're a Christian, that you want to give up your favourite food or your favourite red wine or whatever it is for 1 month, and think about how challenging that is for you, and you don't even have an addiction. So for somebody who's got to fundamentally change their behaviour, it's huge. I mean, it is literally life-changing. And of course, the other thing is that when people start to get serious about putting down substances and start to get periods of clean time, as we call it, maybe they manage to get clean for 30 days and pick up a 30-day keyring in a meeting, or maybe they manage to even get 2 months, or maybe even manage to just get 1 day, and that can be an enormous achievement if you've been using every day for a while. when you start to put down the substances and start to behavior change, often that can be when you realize just how difficult it's going to be. That can be when the denial process starts to crumble and you realize just what you're facing. And also that can be when the feelings start to come up, the feelings that you've been suppressing with the drink and the drugs, they can start to come up. You know, for example, the pain around your parents being separated, or the fact that you're being bullied at school, and that you've been using the cannabis to numb the pain of being bullied. And of course, young people are facing all kinds of bullying that my generation never had to contend with, online bullying, or it's just a whole different world. I'm just aware that we haven't got very much time left. Anyway, I hope today has been useful. I'm sorry about the interruptions by Scotty. I hope that wasn't too disturbing for those of you who joined us. This is something that I'm going to be doing on a monthly basis to support letting the light in. And I know that you probably have many more questions, that maybe you know other people who are around the person that you love who might want to join us next time. Do think about questions that you might want to ask and seek answers for. If you want to message me directly, my email is Sarah with an H at sarahgrahamsolutions.com. You can have a look at my website too, which is sarahgrahamsolutions.com. Please, I encourage everybody to go and check out the blog lettingthelightin.com, and to please share that blog with other people. If you're watching as a professional today and you're part of a charity or an organisation, please let parents know about that blog, because the more people who know about it, the more it can grow. Also, please send the blog writer some love for doing an excellent job. You can follow me on Twitter at Addiction Expert. As I said at the beginning of this, I am based in Los Angeles at the moment. I will be coming back to Europe soon. There are support structures out there. I don't think I answered that question adequately. There are plenty of support structures out there. It's very hit and miss, though, depending on which area you live in. If you have gone out to seek help and you haven't got it straight away, or if you've gone to see somebody and you weren't satisfied with the answers you got, don't give up. Do reach out to other parents via Al-Anon. Do reach out to Drug Fam. Don't take no for an answer from your GP if you're seeking some counselling. If your young person's school doesn't have a counsellor, then go and have meetings with them and ask them to hire a counsellor. Every school should have a counsellor for young people these days, because the mental health issues young people are facing are so many, and it's a tough environment out there for young people today, and they need more support and more help. Anyway, that brings us to time today. I hope that was helpful. It's been very nice to talk to you, and I will see you next time. Oh, yes, thank you. And I do need to mention Action on Addiction. Action on Addiction is a fantastic charity in the UK. They're the charity behind Cloud's House, which is a very, very good rehab that I've sent clients to. They also do have a support program to help those people who might have financial challenges, they're very well established. They're experts in their field. They also do training for counsellors, and they also have a very good family program. So please send Action on Addiction some love. Yeah, that brings us to a close today. I will see you next time. Thank you. I have to remember how to switch off Facebook Live. I don't remember how to do that, but I'll try and work it out. Oh, there we are. Finish. Simple.